He was a U.S. veteran carrying wounds that never healed, explosions, screams, and the faces of fallen brothers haunting him every night. Jim Walker left everything behind, driving all the way to Alaska just to outrun the memories tearing him apart. With the last of his money, he bought a frozen cabin deep in the wilderness, hoping to find the silence that war had stolen from him. But on the very first night,
Easy there,
Rex,
son.
the only friend he still had from the battlefield, growled
You're
a warning.
safe now, I've got
And when
you.
Jim lifted the old blanket in the corner, he didn't find a ghost from his past. He found a bruised, trembling boy whispering, "Don't let him find me." In that moment, Jim realized the war had never truly ended. It was leading him into a new battle to protect an innocent child. Winter in Kodiak, Alaska, was not a season. It was a force that swallowed entire towns in sheets of white silence. The small fishing city at the island's edge crouched under the weight of icy winds, its wooden houses creaking like old ships. Jim Walker drove past the harbor as waves of snow slapped against the truck's windshield. At 50, Jim carried the hard look of a Marine veteran who had survived too many sandstorms and buried too many brothers. His face was sharp, carved by years of discipline, and his short military haircut revealed streaks of gray earned from battlefields he never spoke about. Rex, his 10-year-old German shepherd with thick black and tan fur, sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the world with soldier-like alertness. Jim had come to Alaska because silence was the only thing he hadn't tried yet. His nights were long battles with memories, flashes of explosions, the metallic smell of burning sand, and the ghostly faces of Marines he failed to save. A therapist once described him as a man carrying invisible shrapnel. Jim simply called it noise. Today he had one plan: spend his remaining savings on a forgotten log cabin deep in the snowy forest, a place where the world couldn't reach him. Rex, sensing the heaviness inside his companion, nudged Jim's arm gently every few miles, reminding him that he wasn't alone. They followed a narrow, unplowed road that disappeared into the spruce trees like a path leading nowhere. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, a slanted roof, weather-beaten structure with frost crawling across its windows. Snow weighed it down like an aging giant, and the logs were gray from years of storms. But to Jim, it felt honest. A place damaged but still standing. He stepped outside, boots crunching through knee-deep snow, and exhaled a cloud of steam into the frigid air. The cold bit into his skin, but it was a clean pain, unlike the kind that lived in his memories. Rex hopped out and immediately scanned the perimeter, tail stiff, nose twitching. Rex was not just a pet. He had served beside Jim overseas, trained in K-9 operations, fiercely loyal and impossibly intelligent. Even in old age, his guarding instincts remained sharp. Jim unlocked the front door, the rusted metal groaning like it hadn't been touched in years. The interior smelled of old wood, stale smoke, and something else. Something faint and human. A toppled chair lay near the fireplace, and strips of torn fabric hung from a nail, as if someone had ripped them in a hurry. Rex growled low, his fur bristling, eyes focused on the far corner. Jim's muscles tensed automatically, a habit from years of clearing buildings in combat zones. He scanned the room with practiced precision, noting every shadow, every disturbance. The floor bore faint scuff marks, and the air felt disturbed, as if recently shared with another person. Jim raised a gloved hand, signaling Rex to approach slowly. In the far corner, beneath a pile of old blankets and an overturned crate, something shifted, subtle but unmistakable. Jim stepped carefully, his breath steady, the Marine in him taking control. When he finally crouched beside the moving blankets, Rex stood beside him, ears pointed forward. Jim pulled the top layer back and froze. Beneath the fabric was a boy, no older than 8 or 9, his face pale with exhaustion, cheeks red from exposure. His hair was brown, messy, and tangled like he had slept outside for days. He clutched a torn backpack to his chest as if it were armor. The boy stared at Jim with wide, frightened hazel eyes. His small body trembled violently, not just from the cold, but from terror. He wore a thin blue hoodie far too light for Alaska's deadly frost, and his jeans were ripped at the knees, revealing bruised purple skin. His shoes were mismatched, one boot, one sneaker, both soaked and stiff. Jim felt a knot form in his chest. He had seen children like this in war zones, scared, cornered, waiting for someone to hurt them. Rex lowered himself, tail softly brushing the floor in an attempt to calm the boy, showing he wasn't a threat. "Hey," Jim said gently, lowering his voice to baritone warmth, the way he used to speak to traumatized civilians overseas. "You're okay. No one's here to harm you." The boy flinched at the sound, gripping his backpack tighter. Jim noticed small scars on the child's knuckles. Old, faded, but telling. This wasn't the first time he had run from something. Rex crawled closer and rested his head near the boy's hand. Slowly, the child reached out and touched the dog's fur, fingers shaking with cold. It was the first sign of trust Jim saw. He removed his gloves and extended a hand, palm open, patient. After a long silence, the boy's lips parted. His voice was barely audible, raspy from cold and fear. "Please, don't send me back." The word struck Jim like a bullet. He didn't know where "back" was, but he recognized the desperation in the boy's tone. It was the same tone he had heard from young refugees begging not to be returned to danger. Jim asked softly, "What's your name, kid?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Eli." The name trembled out like it carried weight, as if saying it out loud put him at risk. Jim nodded slowly, understanding more than Eli realized. There was a story here, a dark one. Jim wrapped Eli in a thicker blanket and brought him closer to the dying fireplace. Rex lay protectively beside the boy, warming him with his body. Jim added wood to the fire, sparks rising in the dim cabin light. He studied Eli carefully. The child had a thin frame, hollow cheeks, and fear etched so deeply into his posture that even warmth couldn't soften it yet. Jim brewed warm water with a heating tin, knowing the boy needed warmth before answers. Eli watched every movement, eyes darting like a cornered animal. Jim recognized the survival instincts. He had seen them in soldiers much older than this child. As snow hammered the roof and wind howled through the trees, Jim made a choice he didn't fully understand yet. He had come to Alaska to escape people, to escape noise, to escape himself. But now, sitting inside a frozen cabin with a broken child leaning against Rex, Jim felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Whatever Eli was running from, he wouldn't face it alone anymore. Jim tightened the blanket around the boy and said quietly, "You're safe here." Eli looked up, eyes glassy, and whispered again, "Please don't let him find me." Those words settled like ice in Jim's heart. He nodded once. He would protect Eli, no matter who was coming for him. The storm outside grew harsher by the minute, wind slamming against the cabin walls with the violence of an ocean tide. Jim Walker added another log to the fire, watching the sparks flick upward before dimming into the cold air. Eli sat wrapped tightly in layers of blankets, small shoulders trembling, though he no longer shivered from the cold alone. Rex lay between them like a living barrier, his black and tan fur bristling whenever the wind moaned too deeply. Jim studied the boy carefully, noticing the raw scrape along Eli's forearm and the way his lips pressed together whenever he tried to hide pain. Jim knew that look. Children in war zones had worn the same expression. "Drink slowly," Jim said as he handed Eli a warm tin cup filled with melted snow. Eli gripped the cup with both hands, fingers thin and scratched, knuckles swollen. The warm steam fogged his dirt-smudged face. Jim kept his voice calm and low, careful not to trigger the fear lingering in the boy's eyes. Outside, the storm roared as if trying to break into the cabin. Inside, Jim felt another storm building, one made of questions. He watched Eli flinch at every loud gust, and Rex leaned closer, gently pressing against the boy's side. The child's breathing steadied only when Rex's warmth seeped through the blankets. Hours passed before Eli spoke again. His voice was faint but clearer than before. Is it safe here?" he asked, eyes darting towards the windows every few seconds. His fear wasn't random. It was focused, directed towards something, or someone outside. Jim nodded slowly, leaning forward on one knee. He kept his tone firm but reassuring, the tone he had used to steady younger Marines during panic attacks. "You're safe for now, but I need to understand what happened so I can protect you." Eli hesitated, rubbing his thumb along the torn strap of his backpack. The movement seemed habitual, a nervous tic developed from too many nights spent on the run. Jim didn't push. He simply waited. Eventually, Eli whispered the first truth he dared to share. "Someone's looking for me." His small voice cracked like frozen wood. "A man." The fire popped loudly, and the boy flinched, tightening the blanket around himself. Jim watched the reaction closely, noticing how Eli's shoulders tensed whenever he said the word man. This wasn't a child scared of shadows. This was a child running from a threat that had a face, a voice, and a reach. Jim felt a familiar heat rise in his chest, the protective instinct that came from years spent pulling civilians out of danger. Rex responded too, lifting his head and staring at Jim as if sensing his shift in mood. Jim checked Eli's shoes, one boot and one sneaker, both stiff with frozen slush. "How long were you out there?" he asked. Eli didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted the edge of his jeans, revealing a swollen ankle marked with dark bruising. Jim inhaled sharply. The injury was days old, untreated, and likely caused by a fall or someone grabbing him. "You've been wandering in this weather for at least 2 or 3 days, Jim concluded. Eli hugged his knees closer, as if trying to disappear into the blanket. "I didn't know where to go," he murmured. "The cabin. It looked empty. I thought I could hide here." The storm grew darker, snow pounding the windows so hard that flakes stuck to the glass. The cabin groaned under the pressure. Jim checked the logs stacked by the fireplace and realized they had less fuel than he thought. He stood, stretching stiff joints, and moved to inspect the cabin's wooden shutters. Many were loosely hinged or cracked from weather damage. Jim worked quickly, reinforcing them with leftover planks and nails he found near the stove. Eli watched him silently, studying the methodical care in Jim's movements. When the Marine veteran worked, he looked like a man who'd built shelters in far worse conditions. His rough hands, scarred but precise, moved with practiced discipline. As the wind sharpened, Eli's panic slowly resurfaced. He kept glancing at the door as though expecting it to burst open at any moment. Jim returned to his side, setting a lantern on a nearby crate. Its warm light softened the cabin's rough edges. "You're safe," Jim repeated. But Eli shook his head weakly. "He always finds me." Jim didn't respond immediately. He needed the truth, not fragments of fear. "Who?" he finally asked. Eli's chest rose and fell rapidly, breath trembling. His eyes glossed with tears he refused to release. After a long moment, he whispered, "My stepfather." The word hung in the air like smoke. Eli's voice grew quieter as he continued. He's not a good man." The understatement in those words hit Jim harder than a shout would have. The boy looked down, pulling the blanket tighter. "He got angry a lot, at everything. I tried to be quiet so he wouldn't notice me." Jim felt his jaw tighten. He had met men like that, abusers who preyed on people weaker than themselves, who broke others because they were already broken inside. Eli added, "When he drank, he'd get worse, and when Mom left, he said I was the reason she didn't come back." The pain in the boy's voice filled the room like cold smoke. Jim placed a gentle hand on Eli's shoulder. "He's not getting near you," he said firmly. That certainty surprised even him. He had come to Alaska to escape responsibility, not take on a new one. But looking at Eli now, small, bruised, exhausted, Jim felt something shift inside him, something old and familiar, the sense of duty that had once driven him through battlefields. Rex nudged Jim's leg, as if approving the vow. Jim stood again, checking the cabin door, then grabbed his snow-worn toolkit to reinforce it. Over the years, war had trained him well in how to secure a vulnerable position. The hours deepened into night. The storm tightened its grip. The air inside grew colder despite the fire. Jim gave Eli a second blanket, noticing the boy's face soften with relief. For the first time since Jim had found him, Eli's posture loosened slightly. "What's your name?" Jim asked quietly, wanting the boy to reclaim something of himself. Eli hesitated only a moment before answering. "Eli." The name came out fragile but steady. Jim repeated it, giving it weight. "All right, Eli. We'll get through this storm, and then we'll figure out what to do next." The boy nodded slowly, comforted by the certainty in Jim's tone. Night settled fully, and the wind sliced against the cabin like claws. Eli leaned against Rex, the dog's warmth finally easing his shivering. Jim added the last of the firewood to the stove, knowing they would need to ration carefully until morning. He sat beside Eli, not too close, but close enough that the boy felt protected. The flickering fire cast moving shadows across Jim's face, highlighting the lines carved by years of duty and grief. For the first time since arriving in Alaska, Jim felt the noise in his mind soften. Not because the memories were gone, but because someone else needed him more. The storm outside isolated them completely. But inside the cabin, something fragile and important had begun. Morning came slowly, filtered through the storm clouds like a dim gray veil. Jim Walker woke first, stiff from the cold that had crept into the cabin despite their efforts. Rex lifted his head, ears twitching toward the door before Jim even moved. Jim rubbed his temples, then crouched beside Eli, who slept curled against Rex, still clutching his worn backpack. Jim stood, grabbed his parka, and stepped carefully toward the front door. Outside the frost-covered window, pale daylight revealed the aftermath of the storm, a smooth blanket of white except for something that made his blood tighten, a trail of footprints circling the cabin in wide arcs. Adult-sized. Fresh. Jim opened the door enough for Rex to slip out first. The German Shepherd surged forward, nose low, tracing the tracks that wound through the snow like a warning. Jim followed, boots sinking deep into the frost. The prints were large, at least a man's size 11, heavy, spaced sharply apart, suggesting someone strong and determined. He crouched to inspect the depth. The snow was compacted, meaning the person had walked through only hours earlier, likely while they slept. Rex gave a low growl, hackles rising along his spine. Jim scanned the tree line, seeing nothing but skeletal branches weighed down by ice. Whoever it was had come close, then watched. He returned inside and shut the door firmly, setting the metal latch with deliberate force. Eli had woken, his hazel eyes wide with fear the moment he saw Jim's expression. Jim took a breath to steady his voice. "Someone was here last night," he said plainly, circling the cabin. Eli's small hands tightened on the blanket. "He found me," the boy whispered. Jim knelt beside him, voice low but strong. "Not yet, but he's looking." Eli's breathing turned shallow, panic threatening to take over. Rex pressed against the boy's side, grounding him. Jim took the child's wrist gently to check the swollen ankle. Still bad, but not worse. They would not be able to run, even if they wanted to. Jim began reinforcing the cabin. He moved with precision, closing gaps with spare planks, tightening hinges, wedging furniture against vulnerable points. Years of combat deployments had taught him how to secure structures under threat. Eli watched silently, taking in every motion. "Why does he want you so badly?" Jim asked, while hammering a board across a cracked shutter. Eli hesitated, then spoke in a voice too small for the weight it carried. "He doesn't want me," he corrected. "He just wants to own me, control me." Jim let the hammer fall still. A familiar disgust surged through him. He had seen men like that overseas, men who broke others because they could. The fire had nearly died overnight, so Jim stoked it back to life, stacking logs carefully while the flames crawled upward. The warmth helped Eli relax slightly, though his shoulders never fully lowered. Jim observed the boy's face. The fading bruises along his cheekbone, the tension in his jaw, the way he recoiled slightly every time wind slammed against the walls. "Your mom?" Jim asked gently, gauging the reaction. Eli swallowed. "She tried to protect me. That's why he hates me. He said I ruined everything." Jim felt a cold anger settle beneath his ribs. He understood now why the man hunted the boy. Spite, possession, ego. The ugliest kind of cruelty. Rex suddenly barked sharply, alerting Jim to movement outside. Jim grabbed his coat and peered through the frosted window. No figure, no sound, just the wind sweeping loose snow. But the trail of footprints had deepened in one spot, as if someone had paused there longer than elsewhere. Someone had stood close enough to see through the cracks of the cabin. Jim's skin prickled. "He was watching us," Jim murmured. Rex pressed his nose against the door, tail stiff. Jim stepped back, forced himself not to draw his knife or firearm out of pure habit. Alaska was quiet, but isolation cut both ways. Out here, cries for help would die in the snow before reaching anyone. Eli watched Jim anxiously. "He won't stop," the boy whispered. "Even when the police came before, he just waited. Then he said he'd make me disappear next time." Jim sat down across from him, hands clasped. "Listen to me," he said, locking eyes with Eli. "That man lost legal custody. He has no right to you anymore. And as long as you're here, he's not taking you." The words were steel, not comfort. Eli blinked back tears he didn't want to show. Rex rested his head on the boy's leg. Jim recognized the moment. This was the fragile space between fear and trust, where the truth finally found a voice. Jim moved to prepare food, simple melted snow mixed with canned soup, something warm enough to steady them. As he worked, he kept glancing toward the door, aware now of every creak and gust. Eli spoke softly behind him. "Back home, I hid in closets sometimes, or behind the shed, or under the stairs." Jim paused, hands tightening around the ladle. Eli continued, voice cracking. He always found me. That's why I ran. Jim exhaled slowly, forcing his anger into stillness. You did the right thing, Jim said. Running saved your life. Eli looked uncertain but hopeful, the first glimmer of trust breaking through the fear clinging to him like frost. By midday, the storm had eased just enough to show the forest outside. Quiet, white, and deceptively calm. Jim checked the perimeter again, bootprints crunching over yesterday's snow. The footprints that circled the cabin led back into the trees in a straight line. Whoever made them had not run. He had walked away deliberately, confidently, a man convinced he would return. Jim followed the trail with his eyes until it vanished into the forest's gray haze. Rex stood next to him, fur lifted by the cold breeze, nose twitching in the direction of the prints. Something in Rex's posture told Jim enough. The man was still nearby. Inside again, Jim closed the door and slid the heavy wooden beam across it. The cabin grew quiet, except for the fire's crackle. Eli looked up when Jim approached. He's close, isn't he? The boy asked. Jim didn't sugarcoat it. Yes, and he'll come back. Eli's breath hitched, but Jim continued, voice steady. We'll be ready. The promise was not dramatic. It was a soldier's vow, forged from instinct, experience, and the fierce need to protect the vulnerable. Rex lay beside Eli, one paw resting lightly over the child's leg as if claiming him. Jim watched them, feeling something old ignite inside him, a purpose he thought he had buried. Night approached again, shadows stretching across the floor. Jim sat between Eli and the door, listening to the creaks of the cabin settling under the cold. He knew this quiet would not last. The man hunting Eli was methodical, patient. He had come here after days of searching. He would not give up now. Jim rested one hand on Rex's back and the other near his gear. The boy fell asleep eventually, head against Rex's fur. Jim stayed awake long after, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. Tomorrow, he thought, the real danger begins. Snow drifted across the frozen clearing as Jim Walker stepped outside the cabin, tightening the drawstring of his military-grade parka against the morning wind. Rex hovered at his heel, ears stiff, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. The night had been restless. Eli, the frightened boy Jim had rescued, woke repeatedly from nightmares, whispering about the man in the dark. Now, as Jim surveyed the Alaska wilderness, he sensed a shift in the air, a disturbance as real as the cold biting his face. This land was unforgiving, but whatever was coming felt far more dangerous than the storm clouds gathering over the ridge. The rumble appeared first, faint, metallic, unnatural against the silence of snow, then grew into a grinding roar as a single snowmobile burst from between the pines. It slid to a stop near the frozen stream. The rider dismounted with a heavy thud. He was tall, at least 6'3", with a broad frame stuffed inside a black insulated coat stained by oil and frost. His beard was thick and jagged, streaked with gray, and his cheek carried a pale scar that twisted toward his ear. His eyes were sharp, predatory, the kind that measured threats rather than people. Jim felt Rex shift closer, muscles tightening like coiled wire. Jim didn't move. He raised a deliberate hand, palm open, signaling caution rather than fear. "Morning," he said, keeping his voice steady. The man didn't answer right away. He simply studied Jim with a cold, calculating stare. His breath split the air in slow, heavy bursts. Up close, the stranger smelled faintly of gasoline and wet steel, like someone who lived around machinery more than people. "I'm looking for someone," he finally growled, his voice rough, edged with a territorial dominance. "A kid, small, dark hair. Name's Eli." Jim felt the name drop like a stone between them. Inside the cabin, Eli peeked through one cracked window. The boy's face, pale, thin, still bruised from whatever life he escaped, drained of color the moment he saw the stranger. He backed away, shaking, gripping the wooden table as if it were the last solid object in his world. Jim didn't look towards the window, didn't give anything away. But he felt Eli's dread from across the snow, the same dread he had shown on the first night when he whispered that someone was coming for him. Now Jim knew that the threat had a face, a voice, and a snowmobile. Rex growled low, the sound vibrating through the frozen air. The stranger's gaze dropped to the German shepherd, evaluating him with the quick, instinctive judgment of someone who had dealt with dangerous dogs before. "Call off your mutt," he snapped. Jim didn't flinch. "He's not the problem here." The man smirked, a small, mocking twist of his scarred cheek. "Depends who you ask." He stepped closer, crunching fresh tracks into the snow. Jim shifted his weight subtly, forming a barrier between the cabin and the intruder. The wind howled, carrying the tension with it. "I'll make this simple," the man continued, his gloved hands flexing near the hem of his coat. "The boy belongs to me." His tone was possessive, like Eli was property, an object he misplaced and intended to reclaim. Jim's jaw locked. Years of Marine discipline throbbed beneath his calm expression. "Kids don't belong to anybody," he said, "especially not to someone who terrifies them." A spark of hostility flashed in the man's eyes. "You don't know a damn thing about what's going on. Hand him over and we won't have problems." Rex's growl deepened. Jim held his ground, planting his boots firmly into the snow. "Not happening," he said. The man's nostrils flared, his breath quickened in frustration or calculation. Jim watched his posture shift, saw the flicker of impulsive violence pushing behind his eyes. This wasn't a man used to hearing the word no. He stepped forward until only a few feet separated them. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Jim didn't blink. "I know enough, and I know you're not taking him." Rex stepped in front of Jim now, head lowered, teeth visible beneath curling lips. For a moment, the world narrowed to silence. The cold, the wind, the snow hanging mid-air, as if Alaska itself waited to see what would happen next. The stranger looked down at Rex, then back up at Jim. A reluctant smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth, less amusement and more acknowledgement of a temporary stalemate. "Fine," he said at last, stepping back toward his snowmobile. "Keep him, for now." He dragged one gloved finger across his throat, a clear, sour symbol of the threat behind his words. Jim didn't respond. He simply stood as Rex pressed against his leg, steady as steel. The man climbed onto his snowmobile, revving the engine until it snarled like a wild machine. Before speeding off, he leaned sideways and shouted over the roar, "I'll be back, and next time I won't come alone." The snowmobile shot across the clearing, disappearing into the maze of white pines, leaving a trail of disturbed snow in its wake. Jim exhaled slowly. Rex barked once, sharp, signaling the danger wasn't gone, only delayed. Jim knew the stranger wasn't bluffing. Men like him didn't leave warnings, they left destruction. And he would return with more. Jim stepped inside the cabin and closed the door, sliding the wooden bar into place. Eli sat near the hearth, knees pulled to his chest, eyes wide and wet. "He found me," the boy whispered, voice trembling. Jim crouched beside him, placing a steadying hand on the boy's shoulder. "Listen," Jim said firmly but gently. You're safe here. You hear me? I'm not letting anyone take you." Eli squeezed his eyes shut, fighting tears. "He's bad, Mr. Walker. He's really bad." Jim nodded slowly. "I figured." Rex lay beside them, pushing his warm body against Eli's side. As snow continued to fall outside, Jim felt the weight of responsibility settle deeper into him. This was no longer about offering shelter to a scared boy. It was about standing against a threat that moved through the shadows of the Alaska wilderness. Whoever that man was, he had resources, confidence, and a reason to believe Eli was his to reclaim. Jim stared at the frosted window, the distant pines now carrying a sinister promise. "We'll prepare," Jim murmured. "Whatever's coming, we'll be ready." Rex lifted his head, ears perked as if answering the vow. The cabin crackled with heat from the fire, but the tension inside remained cold and sharp. Jim checked his rifle, his emergency supplies, and the reinforced locks he had installed 2 days before. Eli watched him closely, fear giving way to a fragile kind of trust. Night approached quickly in Alaska, draping the land in deep blue shadows. Jim knew the man would return. Men like him thrived in darkness. But Jim Walker had faced worse storms, both on battlefields and within his own mind. And now, with Rex at his side, and a terrified boy depending on him, he would fight again. The storm rolled in fast, sweeping across the Alaska forest with a low, rumbling growl as night settled over the frozen land. Inside the cabin, Jim Walker stood by the window, one hand gripping the curtain's edge, while the other rested near the rifle leaning against the wall. His rugged face, lined by years of combat and hardship, reflected faint glimmers of firelight. He wore his military cold-weather parka zipped up to his collarbone, breath steady but tense. Rex lay beside Eli, ever watchful, while Eli pressed himself against the wall, his thin shoulders trembling beneath an oversized wool blanket. The boy's dark, messy hair fell over wary eyes that refused to blink. The first engine sound cut through the wind like a razor. Jim's instincts fired instantly. He reached up and snuffed the lantern flame, plunging the cabin into darkness, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of moonlight, filtering through frost-coated windows. Rex lifted his head, ears snapping upright. Eli gasped quietly, his hands curling around the blanket's edge as he searched Jim's shadowed figure for reassurance. "Stay low," Jim whispered, voice calm, the same tone he once used to steady scared soldiers. Eli obeyed immediately, crouching behind the small wooden table. A second engine joined the first, louder, closer, heavier. Snowmobiles, 2 of them, cut through the storm as their headlights danced across the distant pines. Jim felt his breath slow, focusing as he had during countless ambushes. Rex moved silently to Jim's side, the German shepherd's muscular form outlined by the faint moonlight. 5 years old, strong and intelligent, Rex lowered his stance, ready to spring at a moment's notice. Outside, shapes moved, dark, predatory shadows cutting across the white expanse. The first snowmobile slid into view, its lights scattering across the icy window. A man stepped off, shorter than the scarred man from earlier, perhaps around 40, with a rounder build and a hood pulled low over a pale, stubbled face. He lifted a flashlight, sweeping its beam across the cabin's walls. His movements were jittery, restless, like someone fueled by fear and obligation rather than confidence. Jim noted every detail, assessing him quickly as a follower rather than a leader. The wind screamed louder as the storm intensified. The second snowmobile arrived moments later, and another figure dismounted. This one was a woman, tall, wiry, mid-30s, with sharp cheekbones and icy blonde hair pulled into a tight braid peeking from beneath her fur-lined hood. Her complexion was pale from the cold, lips thin and tense. She moved with a soldier's precision, scanning the area with a small, tactical flashlight. A faint scar cut across her right eyebrow, suggesting a history of violence or survival training. Unlike the jittery man beside her, she radiated confidence and calculation. Jim crouched next to Rex, steadying the dog with one hand. He watched the beam of the woman's flashlight slide across the icy window. Rex didn't break focus. Eli curled tighter behind the table, trying to make himself smaller. The boy's breath trembled visibly in the cold air, though Jim kept the cabin heat low enough to avoid drawing attention. Snowflakes slammed against the walls like gravel. The storm howled, reducing visibility, turning nature into an unexpected ally. Outside, the two figures moved around the cabin, their boots crunching deep into fresh snow. The tall blonde woman gestured toward the window, mouthing words Jim couldn't hear but could read. "He's in there." The jittery man nodded nervously, fumbling with something beneath his coat. Likely a weapon. Jim steadied his breathing, his mind calculating escape routes, angles, potential points of entry. He hadn't felt tension like this since Afghanistan, when darkness held equal measures of danger and salvation. A sudden beam of light pierced through the cabin's thin curtain. Jim flattened against the wall, rifle resting across his knees. The flashlight swept over the interior, catching a glimpse of the table, the hearth, the shadows where Eli hid. Jim exhaled slowly, moving only his eyes. Rex's fur bristled, the dog's growl forming silently in his chest. Eli clutched his blanket, knuckles white. Outside, the woman stepped closer, pressing her ear against the cabin wall as though listening for movement inside. The storm intensified, winds screaming hard enough to shake the cabin walls. Snow blasted sideways, reducing the invaders' visibility. Jim realized this blizzard, usually a threat, was now a shield. He moved quietly to the door, positioning himself behind it. His military cold-weather parka rustled softly as he raised the rifle, barrel angled away from Eli and Rex. The boy's frightened gaze met Jim's steady one, and even in the dim light, Jim offered a reassuring nod. The jittery man suddenly shouted something, barely audible over the wind, but his tone gave away fear. He wanted to retreat. The blonde woman, however, shook her head sharply. She stepped toward the door, trying the handle. Jim felt it twitch. Rex tensed. Eli gasped into his hands. Jim braced for impact, ready to respond if they forced their way in. He wouldn't fire unless necessary, but he would protect the boy with everything he had. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the forest in a brief, violent flash. The woman backed away, startled. The jittery man stumbled in the snow, nearly dropping his weapon. Jim watched carefully through the sliver of window not covered in frost. The storm was becoming unbearable, even for armed intruders. The blonde woman cursed, her breath forming sharp clouds, and gestured for a temporary retreat. They stepped back toward their machines, though Jim knew they weren't giving up, only regrouping. Dangerous people always did. Jim waited 10 long seconds after the engines roared back to life before lowering his rifle. He moved to Eli, lifting his chin gently. The boy's dark eyes shimmered with fear, but also something new: trust. Jim's rugged features softened as he tousled Eli's hair. "They won't get you. Not tonight," he whispered. Rex nuzzled the boy's arm, steady and warm despite the cold. Outside, the storm swallowed the forest whole, hiding every threat beneath its furious white blanket. The wind screamed against the cabin walls, rattling every beam like the mountain itself was shaking. Jim Walker pressed his back to the door, feeling each violent gust trying to force its way inside. Snow swirled past the cracked window, thick enough to blur the tree line into a white wall. Rex stood beside him, fur bristling, growling low at the unnatural silence that followed. Silence that only happened when danger was waiting. Eli sat on the floor near the fireplace, hugging his knees tight, his small face pale under the flickering firelight. The boy's breath trembled, fogging in the cold air, biting through every gap in the walls. A sudden smash shattered the quiet. Glass sprayed across the cabin floor as the window exploded inward. A thick, gloved arm forced through the frame, sweeping aside shards. A man in a black winter coat hauled himself through, landing heavily on the wooden boards. He was big, around 40, with a blocky jaw, a trimmed beard iced over from the storm, and eyes sharp with the cruelty of someone who had long enjoyed power over others. Jim recognized the stance instantly. Predator, trained or otherwise, and dangerous. Without hesitation, Jim stepped between the intruder and the boy, raising his voice in a low command for Eli to stay back, while Rex bared his teeth and lowered himself into a defensive crouch. The man lunged first, swinging a crowbar. Jim dodged sideways, the metal grazing his shoulder and splintering the wooden table behind him. Snow poured through the broken window, coating everything in frost. Jim countered with a quick strike to the man's ribs, knocking him off balance. The intruder snarled but didn't retreat. He swung again, and Jim blocked with his forearm, pushing forward as Rex snapped and lunged at the man's leg. The man kicked Rex back, but the dog regained footing instantly, refusing to yield. Eli's frightened gasp echoed through the cabin, fueling Jim's determination to finish this before the boy got hurt. A second figure appeared outside, a lanky man, thinner and younger, maybe mid-20s, with hollow cheeks and restless eyes that darted like he was afraid of his own shadow. His tattered gray parka was patched with duct tape, and his shaky posture revealed someone used to obeying orders out of fear. He hesitated a moment at the window before climbing inside, landing clumsily. Rex reacted first, launching at him with a deep, protective growl. The second intruder stumbled, hands raised as Rex tackled him to the ground, jaws clamping onto his sleeve. The man shrieked, trying to pull away, but Rex held him down, preventing him from rising. Jim didn't have time to watch. The first intruder charged him again. They crashed into the dining bench, sending it sliding across the floor. Jim grabbed the crowbar mid-swing, twisting it from the man's grip. The intruder slammed him into the wall, knocking a framed map to the ground. Jim's ribs burned, but he powered through, punching the man square in the jaw. The intruder staggered, stunned for a precious second. Jim did not waste it. He swept a kick beneath the man's legs, knocking him flat, then threw the crowbar across the room to keep it away from both of them. Every instinct in him sharpened. Protect the boy, neutralize the threat, keep Rex safe. Just as Jim moved to restrain the fallen man, a shadow appeared behind Eli. A broad-shouldered figure, bigger than the first two, tore open the back door. Snow billowed inside as he stomped through. His hood fell back, revealing a face worn and rugged, with deep-set eyes that screamed anger and booze-fueled obsession. His beard was overgrown and wild, streaked with gray. His nose was crooked from old fights, and his jawline was scarred from something far worse. This was the boy's stepfather, Dale Crowder. Everything about him radiated danger. He grabbed Eli by the arm and yanked him up, ignoring the boy's scream. Jim spun toward them instantly, but Dale pulled a knife from his belt and pressed it against Eli's throat. "Back off!" he roared, his voice a mixture of rage and desperation. Jim stopped cold, muscles locked, calculating every angle, every possible move that could save the boy without getting him hurt. Rex growled, inching toward Eli, but Jim commanded him to stay back. Dale dragged Eli toward the open door, snow blasting around them. Eli's small boots scraped helplessly across the floor as he cried out for Jim. Dale shoved past the doorway, dragging Eli into the storm and disappearing into the white haze. Jim lunged after them, but the first intruder grabbed his coat from behind. Jim slammed an elbow into the man's chest, breaking free, and sprinted into the blizzard. The cold knifed into his skin instantly, almost stealing his breath. Rex raced ahead, following Eli's fading footprints before the wind erased them. The forest was pitch dark except for the swirling snow reflecting the faint moonlight. Jim heard Eli's muffled cries somewhere ahead, distorted by the roaring storm. He pushed through low branches, stumbling over hidden roots, shouting Eli's name as the wind swallowed every word. Rex barked sharply, alerting Jim to movement ahead. Dale was dragging Eli toward a narrow ravine, the snow deeper there, slowing him. Jim pushed harder, gaining ground. He could see Dale now, huge, lumbering, fighting the storm with brute force. Eli was crying, struggling, calling for Jim with a voice that cracked with terror. Jim felt something hot and fierce surge inside him. He sprinted, closing the distance. Dale turned, raising the knife again, his hand trembling with cold and fury. Jim didn't slow. He dove, tackling Dale from the side, forcing him into the snowbank. The knife flew from Dale's grasp and vanished beneath the powder. Jim pinned him down, fighting against the man's monstrous strength. Dale punched wildly, hitting Jim's cheek hard enough to blur his vision, but Jim held, fueled by pure determination. Rex leaped in, barking viciously, standing guard over Eli. Jim twisted Dale's arm behind him, pressing his weight until the man finally stopped resisting, breath heaving, eyes filled with shock at being overpowered. With the storm howling around them, Jim restrained Dale with a length of rope from his own coat, tying his wrists before hauling him to his feet. Eli ran into Jim's arms the moment the danger passed, burying his face against Jim's parka, sobbing with relief. Jim held him close, whispering reassurances over the roaring wind. Rex circled them protectively, ears alert, tail stiff, ensuring the threat was gone for good. Jim checked Dale one last time to confirm he couldn't escape, then lifted Eli into his arms and headed back toward the cabin. The blizzard clawed at them, but Rex led the way, guiding them step by step through the darkness. By the time they reached the cabin, the fire was still burning, a beacon of warmth in the frozen night. Inside, Jim secured the doors and windows, made sure the other intruders were unconscious and no longer a threat, then wrapped Eli in thick blankets beside the fire. The boy clung to him, shaking, but soon calmed under Jim's steady presence. Rex curled beside Eli, touching his nose gently to the boy's hand. Jim stood watch through the long night, the storm howling outside while the cabin's warmth slowly seeped into their bones. For now, they were safe. And Jim knew one thing with absolute certainty: Eli would never face such darkness alone again. The blizzard eased by dawn, leaving the world around the cabin buried beneath a thick, glittering blanket of snow. Jim Walker stood on the porch with a steaming mug of coffee, watching the first rays of sunlight cut through the pale sky. Rex sat beside him, alert but calm, tail curled around his paws. Inside, Eli slept under layers of blankets near the fire, his small frame finally still after a night of terror. Jim listened to the forest breathe again. No screams, no footsteps, just quiet. For the first time in days, quiet felt like peace rather than the calm before another storm. The sound of distant engines broke the silence. Jim's muscles stiffened, but Rex lifted his head with a soft bark, recognizing something safe rather than threatening. 2 state trooper snowmobiles emerged between the trees, their lights flashing softly in the morning haze. Leading them was Sergeant Linda Harper, a seasoned Alaskan officer in her late 40s, with sharp, steady eyes and a weathered face shaped by decades of winter patrols. Her brown hair, streaked with early gray, was tied back neatly beneath her insulated cap. She had a calm authority, the kind built from surviving both storms and humans at their worst. Linda stepped off her snowmobile and approached Jim with careful respect, her breath misting in the cold. "Walker," she greeted, reading his military posture instantly. "We received the emergency call and found 2 unconscious men back down the trail. You did what you had to do." She wasn't judging him, just acknowledging the reality. Jim nodded silently. Rex sniffed the air around her, then relaxed, sensing her steady demeanor. Linda's partner, Officer Raymond Pike, a tall, broad man in his mid-30s with a trimmed beard and gentle eyes, inspected the tracks near the cabin. He had a calm, empathetic presence, the kind that made people feel immediately safer. "We'll handle the rest," Raymond assured. Inside the cabin, Eli woke as Linda stepped through the doorway. The boy tensed instantly, but she softened her voice, kneeling to his eye level. "Hi, Eli. I'm here to help you." Eli studied her face carefully, reading whether she was someone who shouted, hit, or scared him. Instead, he found warmth and patience. He relaxed slightly, though his grip on Jim's sleeve didn't loosen. Linda's practiced eyes traced the faint bruising around Eli's wrist and neck, marks no child should ever have. She exchanged a knowing glance with Jim. Nothing needed to be said. They both understood. Raymond led Dale Crowder out of the trees shortly after, his wrists zip-tied, face swollen from the struggle, breath thick with the stench of old alcohol. Dale grumbled curses under his breath, but Raymond shut him down with a firm shove. "You're done," the officer warned. Dale was shoved onto the second snowmobile, his expression shifting between anger and a twisted sense of defeat. Linda walked Eli outside, letting him see with his own eyes that the man who terrorized him was no longer free. "He can't hurt you again," she promised him. The wind tugged at her jacket as she emphasized, "The state will make sure of it." Eli didn't speak. Instead, he buried his face against Rex's neck. The German shepherd leaned in, pressing his warm fur against the boy as if anchoring him to safety. Jim watched them closely. It wasn't lost on him how naturally Rex had accepted Eli. No hesitation, no caution. Animals recognized pain in ways humans often overlooked. Linda approached Jim again, paperwork in hand. "We'll file temporary protective custody for Eli immediately," she said. "Given the circumstances, I'm confident the court will rule quickly." Jim nodded, unsure what would come next, but knowing he couldn't let the boy return to a life of fear. Once the officers left with Dale and the other intruders, the cabin felt strangely lighter. Jim closed the door gently, sealing out the last echo of danger. He returned to the fire where Eli sat wrapped in blankets. The boy's voice trembled as he finally spoke. "Jim, do I have to go with them? With the people in town?" His eyes held the weight of someone who had learned too early that adults weren't always protectors. Jim crouched beside him, resting a steady hand on his shoulder. "You're not going anywhere you don't want to go," he said. He meant it with every fiber of his being. Rex nuzzled Eli's knee in agreement. By late morning, the storm clouds parted completely, revealing a bright blue Alaskan sky stretched endlessly over the frozen valley. Jim stepped outside to repair the broken window. Eli followed, bundled in Jim's oversized parka, sleeves swallowing his hands. The boy moved carefully through the snow, watching Jim's every action with quiet admiration. Jim handed him small tasks, holding nails, passing wood strips, and Eli executed each one with serious focus, as though the cabin itself deserved his effort. When a breeze stung Eli's cheeks, Rex nudged him back inside, a guardian through and through. A few hours later, Linda returned, not with paperwork or questions, but with something else entirely: supplies. She carried a large insulated box under one arm and a winter coat in the other. "Thought the kid might need these," she said simply. The coat was navy blue, thick and new. Eli stared at it as though he wasn't sure he was allowed to have something that good. Linda smiled gently. "It's yours," she told him. "No strings attached." Eli slipped into the coat slowly. It fit him perfectly, and for the first time, warmth didn't feel like something borrowed. The day passed quietly, filled with small domestic moments Jim hadn't expected to share with anyone again. Eli helped stack wood. He fed Rex treats, laughing softly every time the big dog licked his hand. Jim noticed how carefully Eli watched him, as if learning what safe looked like. When the sun dipped, behind the mountains, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, Jim brewed hot cocoa for Eli and black coffee for himself. Rex curled at their feet. The cabin felt different, still simple, still lonely, but no longer empty. That evening, Linda returned one last time. She handed Jim an official document sealed in a clear plastic case. "Temporary guardianship," she said. "Given the situation, the judge signed it immediately." Jim stood still, the weight of the paper heavy in his hands, not burdensome, but meaningful. Eli looked up at him with wide eyes, unsure what it meant. Jim took a slow breath and knelt beside him. "It means you're staying here," he said gently. "With me. And Rex." Eli didn't answer. Instead, he threw his arms around Jim in a sudden, fierce hug. Night fell softly. Jim tucked Eli into bed beside the fire, watching the boy drift into the deepest sleep he'd had in years. Rex lay close, chin resting against the blanket as he guarded the boy. Jim looked out the window at the frozen wilderness, understanding something he hadn't been ready to admit until now. He hadn't been searching for peace in Alaska. He'd been searching for purpose, and sometimes, as he had learned again tonight, God didn't send peace wrapped neatly. He sent a person who needed saving, and in saving them, he saved you too. Sometimes God doesn't calm the storm around us. He sends someone into our lives to walk through it with us. Jim learned that peace isn't always the absence of hardship. Sometimes it's the presence of a purpose worth fighting for. In saving Eli, he didn't just rescue a child. He found a family, a calling, and a reason to keep moving forward in a world that can feel unbearably cold. In our everyday lives, we face storms too. Broken relationships, heavy burdens, invisible battles no one else sees. But God's miracles don't always appear as lightning in the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, in the form of someone who needs us, or someone who refuses to give up on us. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel so more people can find hope in moments like these. May God's grace guide your steps, warm your heart, and protect you and your family through every storm you face. God bless you for watching, and may He bring peace to your home tonight.